Welcome to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our December 13th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today we'll try to make some sense of the insane market for used farm equipment with Greg Peterson, who's better known as Machinery Pete. We'll also welcome on Iowa State's Dr. Wendong Zhang later in the episode to share his thoughts on the status of trade relations between the U.S. and China. We'll start with Greg Peterson, a nationally recognized expert on used farm equipment sales, who was one of the featured speakers at Iowa Farm Bureau's annual meeting last week. The spokesman's Tom Block tracked down Greg after his presentation, and here's what he learned.
We're talking with Greg Peterson, better known as Machinery Pete. Greg, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the used equipment market right now. What trends are you seeing as you look at auctions across the country?
Well, Tom, 32 years I've been doing this. I've never really seen a time like this. It's the hottest equipment market, new and used, ever. So if we talk trends, on the one hand, auction pricing is at an all-time high. It was already inching up before commodity prices went up fall of 20, and then it provided another boost. And then it just throughout this year of 2021, it's just continued to go higher and higher. So there's that piece of it, but underneath there's a couple significant trends. Obviously, the supply chain issue is affecting manufacturers in an adverse way. So, if you want that new planter, you can't get it now, which pushes more people back into the used market. And then the other factor that I think gets discounted a little bit is the reality on the dealer used lot, which is the tightest that I've seen it in my 32 years. So, and then we had the strike with John Deere and some other production interruptions overseas on ag equipment. So, geez, you add it all up, and it's just been just a swirl here, resulting in, like I say, a used market that's on fire.
And you've actually seen, as you go to these auctions across the country, things selling used for more than they sold for new. Yeah,
that's almost been happening almost on a daily basis here, fall into the end of the year 2021, Tom. We had a slide here talking to the Farm Bureau folks. I think it was a John Deere 7930. I think it was a sale Sullivan had back maybe 2 months ago. Two brothers. It had a loader, super nice Golke tractor, and it brought I think $17,000 more than they paid for it new. And again, we're seeing that. I was at an auction in Maryland, November 6th. We filmed it for our TV show. It had a 98, I think it was a 98 model Deere 7810 with 914 hours. That brought $170, and that's way more than it sold for new. So. Again, you can't get the new stuff in a lot of cases, and the price of new is skyrocketing so much that when a nice used one shows up, price is secondary. People just got to have it, and then they wind up paying more for it.
Are there specific pieces or market segments that are the hottest sellers that you see?
Well, everything is up, but the hottest sectors, good used tractors, unbelievable. Combines have actually been very strong. Retrofit used planters are very hot. And then maybe the hottest of all here the last couple months, maybe used grain trailers, just because you just physically can't get a new one. So that pushes people into the used market, and we're seeing breathtaking price increases at auction there. So, but again, it's kind of all tied together.
Yeah, in the tractor market, 4-wheel drives and high horsepower, all the way down to the low horsepower things.
Yeah, in fact, the 32 years I've been doing this, Tom, I don't think I've ever seen it like this, where each sector is just red hot. Even back from late 07 into 13 when it was very good. At that time, the small horse tractors, it was okay, but it wasn't on fire by any means. Whereas now, the small stuff's been hot. That was just scorching hot last year when the pandemic started. People that have maybe 10, 50 acres or whatever, or just going nuts buying new small horse tractors, and we were seeing auction prices skyrocket. And as 2021 has played out, the bigger horse, the 4-wheel drives, they took off. And again, if it's a good used tractor, it's worth more than it was.
And one of the things you mentioned in your presentation, when people are offered choice and they just take them all, that's a sign of a hot market.
Yeah, covering auctions for all these years, Tom, I've noticed that, typically like maybe gravity wagons or something, you'll have 2, 3, 4 of them, and when they sell choice, yeah, you're right. When you have a market where the buyer, and you can tell too, because the first one will sell, and it'll be, okay, boom, brought 14,000. Then there's a little pause, and then the auctioneer will say, well, Fred, do you want the rest of them? And the audience there at the auction kind of leans in, and I've been seeing that more often lately where it's like, yep, I'll take them all, times 4. And I've seen it with tractors late this summer into the fall. Again, because the market is so tight, one thing I've been hearing auctioneers say the last month when I've been out on the road is, guys, here it is today. Whether it's a field, this is the nicest 50-foot field cultivator. You know how hard it is to find it. Here it is today. And then, of course, it's not just the people at the auction. It's the huge people online, clicking that bid button. So, again, you swirl it all together, and that stuff has gone up about, generalizing, I would say 12 to over 25%.
And you talk about the online component. How have the auctions themselves changed here, especially since the onset of COVID?
Oh, unbelievable change, Tom. Just incredible. Of course, we've had online bidding for 15 years in the space, so, nothing new there. So I sort of feel like that conditioned the farm audience for this push, but literally when the pandemic hit mid-March of 20, so many auctioneers just immediately, well, they had to. You couldn't have the event. So, I was frankly concerned that we were going to have a lot of cancellations and postponements, and just generally didn't see that happen. The space just leaned in to the online only, and within a month, by end of April 20, I was like, this is something unusual going on here. You can feel it. I tried to do a blog on it one time, and it was, if you get into the industry jargon, there's a term called gamification. So younger people have grown up on cell phones, and the games they play and whatever, it's all computerized, whatever. And then it's sort of like the bidding on this equipment. Auctions have always been emotional events, like, oh, I want this planter, I want this tractor. So, you're trying to judge, well, I think it's worth $200K, I should stop there, but man, do I bid again? And that the barrier to clicking again, it's just like it evaporated. And because the market is so tight now, people get engaged, and it's just incredible what's happened.
What are the factors that play into having a successful auction? You've talked about really personalizing the equipment.
Yeah, I think on the front side, that is the number one thing. Of course, you have to get the word out, like, that hasn't changed on the auction event itself. But what I'm really pushing our auction partners to do is to utilize some of these tools. So like on social media, I started doing Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Well, not Instagram, that came later, but YouTube in 2009. And there was no money in it. I just started pushing. I wanted to build out our Machine Repeat audience. But now, we have over pushing 300,000 followers. So if an auctioneer has a nice sale coming up, definitely get the listing in our Machine Repeat website. We can get eyes on it. Not only there, and this is the other big change, is the old way, if you were having a sale, you kind of promoted the event. Like John Smith is having an auction January 15th in Emerson, Iowa. Well, you still have to do that, but now we can help you market every piece on your auction. Find it on our site plus through Google. So if someone is out there and people don't even know they're searching via Google, but they'll just type in on their computer or iPad or cell phone, like John Deere 7230 for sale. And the whole thing is you got to show up at the top of those Google rankings. And when you do, you can get a lot more eyes on it. So that plays not just with your tractors on your auction, but back down through your gravity wagons, your batwing mower, your planter. We just want to get more eyes on everything you have for sale. And the video component, very simple, but if you can personalize it. Just tell people, if it's a retirement sale, just say, hey, we've been farming here for 40 years, and we're having our sale on January 15th, and my wife and I, and then just, tell us about your tractor. Very simple, not Hollywood. We find those videos very powerful and can really help the promotion of your sale.
We all wish we had a crystal ball and knew where things were going, but your best educated guess, where do you think prices or trends go from here?
Well, through the end of the year, I think it's going to get hotter. This is on a daily basis. The market's just going up, up, up. We've got the year-end tax buyers have piled in, and it's the hottest market I've ever seen. I think there could be a little pause when the calendar flips, just catch our breath a little bit. But with everything structurally in the market right now with supply chain issues, it's going to take manufacturers a while to ramp up production. The price increases are so strong. Dealer lots on the used side are thin. I think used prices and values are going to stay high here at least through the first half, probably more like 2/3 of 2022. Of course, nobody knows with commodity prices. Obviously, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. But even there, structurally, you could argue it looks like 2022 could be a pretty good year. So it's sort of looking like it's going to be a heated market for a while.
And just to wrap up, your website and your services, tell people what they can find, what you offer.
Yeah, just hit our website, folks, machineryrepeat.com. We did open up all the auction prices for free about a year and a half ago, so we update prices every day all over the U.S. and Canada. So if you're wondering what your equipment is worth or you're pricing something, selling, just go machineryrepeat.com, click on the auction price link. Tons of prices there. Of course, we have like 110,000 pieces for sale. If you are looking to sell equipment, we've got two ways to help you. There's a little link that says Sell Mine. It costs $50. You can get it listed. A lot of times then I can get more eyes on it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for you. Or we just started back in August our own Machine Repeat monthly online auction, and we have a new TV show on RFD that previews it every month. So we can help you sell it there, working with our auction partners around the country to come out and get the pictures of your equipment, and it's pretty cool. So if you are looking to sell, hopefully we can help you find a buyer.
A big thank you to Greg Peterson for speaking at our annual meeting and for carving out some extra time for our podcast listeners. That guy is in high demand right now, and we appreciate him sharing some of his insights with us. Next up is Dr. Wendong Zhang to discuss his read on the current trade relationship between the U.S. and China. And if you're a regular listener, you know that we had Dr. Zhang on the podcast back in November to talk about another topic that he knows quite well, Iowa's farmland values. So the interview we're bringing you today is actually the second part of that discussion with Dr. Zhang, which was recorded back on November 18th. So where does the trade relationship between the U.S. and China go from here? The spokesman's Tom Block went looking for the answers.
Wendong, thanks for joining us to discuss the current trade relationship between the U.S. and China and what we can expect moving forward. President Biden and Chinese President Xi recently met in a virtual summit and discussed trade and other issues. Do you believe the U.S.-China trade relationship is calming down after a period of conflict? Why is that, and how will U.S. ag exports be affected by a calmer trade relationship between the two countries?
It's a great timing when we are doing this, and because this week, as you mentioned, on Monday, that the two presidents finally had a virtual summit. And the timing is actually indicative of the situation we're in terms of bilateral relations. It took almost a year to make this happen, where in prior years that this sort of the summit like this will happen much earlier than this. That said, that is sort of indicative of, for the bilateral relations, we're still looking ahead to probably a bumpy relations over the next decade. But as you said, that the tone at least have calmed down, that we're seeing more dialogues, both at the top level, but also at the local level. And thanks to the pandemic, we're having more Zoom conferences involving researchers from the US, China, and Europe as well. Regarding agricultural trade, I think we are seeing a continuation of a change of the tone in terms of rhetoric, but the substance actually largely continued from the Phase 1 deal. If you don't already know that all the tariff imposed during the U.S.-China trade war started in 2018 are largely still in place. So we are still in the long trade war. And what happens is that both countries offer some exemptions. So your agricultural products, when they enter China, China says that we could charge you tariff, but would choose not to. So when you look at the trade in general, that we are actually looking at fairly strong agricultural exports, thanks to two factors. And we'll touch on this, but as I will briefly talk about, one is the as part of the China's commitments to the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal, China bought a lot more agricultural products from the U.S. Another aspect is that China has been recovering its hog herd since 2018, that they have been dealing with African swine fever, and that led to substantial imports of feedstocks such as corn and protein such as pork and beef and poultry, especially last year in 2020.
Now, you mentioned the Phase 1 trade agreement that the Trump administration signed with China in 2020. That's wrapping up. What kind of boost have U.S. ag exports received from that agreement? And do you see any other U.S.-China trade agreements on the horizon?
So I will give a complicated, typical economist answer. When you are looking at the rhetoric, all the increase in the corn and beef exports to China will be credited to the Phase 1 deal. I think this deal probably plays some role. However, I think probably a bigger factor is that when China is rebuilding the hog herd, they need more corn and feedstock, which actually it's indicative that for the current marketing year, we're seeing a slowdown of the Chinese corn and pork imports because that hog rebuilding in China has been largely complete, so which affects some of the shorter term agricultural momentum in terms of exports. So there are some challenges with the Phase 1 deal, with how it's structured, because this is not like the typical trade deal that we will negotiate a reduction of structural tariff or non-tariff barriers, but rather that the two countries set the target and say that China will buy this higher quantity. And this target is actually quite high. And if you look at the data, China roughly bought substantially more agricultural products, but still probably only 75-80% of the promised target as prescribed in the Phase 1 deal. When you look at the other brackets, manufactured goods, energy products, and those performance in terms of the ratio of Chinese actual purchases relative to the target are not really high in terms of percentage. So there's a risk that U.S. government currently is actually evaluating how do we approach this, because you can imagine that a negative review of China's performance as part of the Phase 1 deal could send a downside signal that affects the momentum of even agricultural trade, despite the increase in absolute quantity of ag product going into China. And this is sort of more indicative of the situation we are in, that increasingly we will likely see some seemingly uncorrelated events related to national security, territory disputes, or other things that have nothing to do with ag, but could potentially be more playing a bigger role influencing the sentiments and the actual quantity of the trade. You mentioned trade deals. What is really interesting is there are two developments. One, China just joined the new trade bloc called the RCEP, so Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. And this is essentially China, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and 10 Southeastern Asian countries. So this is significant because the economy covered in this trade pact is the largest in history, and the population is probably the largest in history as well. That this also formulated sort of a free trade setup between Japan and China, and Japan and South Korea for the first time. So that's one that is China is trying to expand the trade with non-US players in that sense. At the same time, China made an interesting bid and application to apply to be admitted to what is now known as the CPTPP trade agreement. So if you recall, in 2017, that President Trump decided to pull out from the trade deal known as the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that is orchestrated by President Obama now, led by Japan. China actually made an application to say that they want to be admitted to this one. And so it's very interesting to see how this is playing out. And because each of the members, and most of them are U.S. allies, have to approve their application, so it's very unlikely China will actually get in. But this is a sort of a shrewd political move to say to the world that they want to be more open to trade, and they want to, as part of the bilateral summit, the Chinese president also said that China want the U.S. to come up with schemes, but doesn't exclude China. And China want to do the same thing as well. That is, for example, that China face a lot more criticism on their initiatives like a Belt and Road Initiative. And China want to say that this is also open to the U.S. if you want to join as well. So there are interesting dynamic on that. There are also discussion of potential. The Biden administration is not calling this a phase 2 agreement, but there are a discussion between the ambassador Catherine Tai with the Chinese officials on how to deal with Chinese industrial subsidies to this state-owned enterprises. But that's a more thorny structural issue. And there are reasons why that was not included in a phase 1 deal, is because that's really hard to deal with. And I don't anticipate it will easily solve that problem.
Let's talk a little bit more about China's efforts to rebuild its hog herd. What's the status of African swine fever in China? And is the disease having an impact on U.S. exports of meats as well as crops?
Yes, so this is a great question. And China still reports sporadic cases of African swine fever. So the most recent one was actually in Xinjiang, in northwest part of China, in May. So they are still dealing with this problem. However, this is largely controlled, and Chinese officials have reported probably they have recovered 98 to 99% of all the hog inventory, to the extent that their domestic pork prices have tanked from the peak of 2019 due to the pork shortage. This definitely have grave consequences for U.S. agricultural exports when we are looking at the substantial surge in fall 2020. It's in part is due to African swine fever. As China rebuilt the hog herd, they need a lot more feed grain. And they actually imported record level of corn, and they decided to not enforce the 7.2 million metric ton tariff rate quota, TRQ, for the corn imports. And they also, because of African swine fever, because of pork shortage, they're imported a lot more beef, pork, and poultry from the U.S. and frankly from all over the place. Right? Currently, what is really playing to the U.S.'s favor is one of the key competitors we have. Germany is also dealing with African swine fever that boosted our exports, especially now if you look at the beef exports to China, it's really strong. It's probably, if not record-breaking, at least near record level. Of course, that I recently had conversation with Secretary Mike Negg, and Secretary is talking about the U.S. is watching closely about the African swine fever in Central America. That is the first time that it occurred over the past few decades. I think the greater concern is to make sure that this doesn't appear in the U.S. market. But in general, China still has it. And China largely have completed the hog rebuilding that we are seeing, probably still robust, but it's less than 2020 because that their demand is driven by African swine fever. It's less this year.
You've also noted in recent presentations that farmers would be better served by a broader portfolio of U.S. ag exports to China instead of such a heavy reliance on just soybeans. Why is a broadening of the portfolio important? And how does it fit with the products the Chinese are currently demanding?
Yes, I have talked about this. And when we are looking at the U.S. agricultural export portfolio, that roughly we export $25 to $30 billion of agricultural products to China. And almost half, and sometimes more than half, are soybeans. And when we are looking at how much China is buying globally, China buys a lot more stuff in addition to soybeans. And U.S. are playing actually a fairly limited role when it comes to the percentage of these products that we could be selling to China, but we're not currently. And two of these brackets are proteins, which we're doing much better, both including pork, beef, and poultry products. And two is our consumer products, that the fresh vegetables, fruits, and nuts, and higher valued dairy products like cheese. So I think that this is beneficial for both countries because from the US perspective, China definitely will have a more strategic incentive to diversify away from the United States because of the trade disruption. For soybean, it's really hard for them to do because that Brazil and US are the dominant and irreplaceable partners. However, that China recently just reported that China has developed technology that can produce proteins using carbon monoxide. So if that becomes more commercial scale, that they are replacing this not based on land, but as they're based on sort of the technology, that they're trying to produce this, and this is also part of the diversification strategy. From China's perspective, and this is also beneficial because that they could have partners and friends not only with Midwestern states in the US, but also build alliance in a way with the coastal states like California and Florida. And they are also needing these products, and the U.S. products are the larger quantity and higher quality ones as well. I think that this is the examples of the mutually beneficial engagement, and especially meaningful as we are seeing more rocky relations in bilateral political relations. And one particular product could become target of some sort of a crossfire down the road. And if you have a more diversified portfolio, then your overall health of the relationship will be more resilient in a sense.
Thanks to Dr. Zhang for his analysis on this important topic. It sounds like our trade relationship with China won't get any less complicated in the near term, so we'll definitely have to keep our sights on how that plays out in 2022 and beyond. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. On behalf of the crew here at Iowa Farm Bureau, we'd like to wish you and yours a very Merry Christmas. Hope you'll join us again after the holiday when we release our next episode on December 27th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.